Hello and welcome to Book Lovers Companion. My name is Edith and you are listening and watching a podcast about books, authors, their craft and more. And joining me for this episode is travel writer, book reviewer and author Ellis Shuman. And as he said before we started the recording, from across another pond, not the Atlantic, the Mediterranean. Hello, Alice, and welcome to Book Lovers Companion.
Good evening, Edith. I'm glad to be here and able to talk to you.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you on. And like I said, it's a different bond and it's not such a huge time difference this time. You are 1 hour ahead of me, so we are quite close.
I'm talking to you from my small community near Jerusalem, Israel. So we are close physically, and certainly through the internet, we're much closer.
Yes, indeed. And we hope that the connection keeps holding up because, like I said before, on a Friday evening, you never know.
Right.
Whatever it is people do, streaming, Netflix, shopping on Amazon, who knows?
Yes. Some people are reading, and that's why we're here.
Yes, indeed. We are here for your readers, for our listeners, for our fans, for our subscribers, to talk about your most recent book, because you have published more than one book already. And it's very interesting to learn for our readers that one country features prominently in your books. One country one wouldn't think about. And it's a collection of short stories about Bulgaria. And it came out in 2024. And I would like to ask you to tell our listeners what you can tell us about this collection of short stories.
Well, first of all, let me tell the listeners about my connection to Bulgaria, because I was born in the United States, Sioux City, Iowa. At the age of 15, my parents moved the entire family to Jerusalem, Israel. My parents had, of course, a great desire to live in the Jewish state and to raise their children in the Jewish state. I finished high school in Jerusalem, served in the Israeli army, was a founding member of a kibbutz, a collective agricultural society in the desert. I raised a family, moved to my current home near Jerusalem, worked in many different fields. My career took me to hotels and eventually to the internet marketing, which is where I've been working for the last 25 years. And at a later stage in my career, having lived in Israel all of my adult life, my boss came to me and said, "Your job position is being relocated to Sofia, Bulgaria, and you have 1 week to decide whether you will make the move from Israel to Sofia, Bulgaria. And if you don't agree, someone else will take your job and be your boss from overseas for Israel. From Israel, you would have a boss in Sofia." So I turned to my wife. Our children had already grown up, left home. We were well into the later stages of our middle age. And we said, should we go launch this amazing adventure? And we moved to Sofia, Bulgaria for a 2-year contract. And we fell in love with the country. This was the first time we had ever visited Bulgaria. And we moved there to work overseas. Well, for us, it's overseas, remotely from Bulgaria for example, for my job in Tel Aviv. And in the 2 years we lived in Bulgaria, we traveled extensively around the country. Late in the stages of my middle age, my boss came to me and said that my position in internet marketing was being relocated to Sofia, Bulgaria. And I had 1 week to decide whether to accept the position. If not, someone would be appointed to take my place, working from Sofia and be my boss in our office in Tel Aviv. I turned to my wife and said, let's launch this adventure. We moved to Sofia, Bulgaria for a 2-year relocation contract, and we fell in love with the country. This is the first time we had never visited Bulgaria before. This is the first time in the country. We utilized the 2 years living in Sofia to travel extensively around Bulgaria, to learn about its culture, history, its picturesque villages, its stunning nature, and we fell in love with the country. Um, I've always desired to be a writer, and when the 2-year contract ended and we came back to Israel, I realized that I could go back to Bulgaria every day through my writing. And that's when I began to write about Bulgaria.
I see. And like I said before, when I introduced you, the collection of short stories isn't the first book you wrote about Bulgaria. So having read the short stories, not the other books, unfortunately, yet quite yet, this collection, where did the ideas come from, or how did they come to you, those stories?
The first 2 books I wrote about Bulgaria were suspense novels. And writing a novel is a long, laborious process. Lately, I've been devoting myself to writing short stories. And over the past few years, I've been writing short stories set in Bulgaria. So this was a chance to collect them all in one book. And the stories that are in Rakia, some of them are told in the voices of native Bulgarians, and others are told voices of people visiting Bulgaria for the first time, whether it's as people coming from Israel to work, people from Israel visiting the country, or even people from the United States visiting and experience what it is to be in Bulgaria, to travel around the country and to learn about the country. So the collection of short stories is Rakia. There's 12 stories. Some of them, they're all works of fiction, some of them based on my experiences in the country. And it was a joy to share my love for Bulgaria through my fiction.
And you just said that some of the stories come from your own experience. Having been in Bulgaria for 2 years, how much of the country did you get to experience? And because you were there for work, of course, and one wonders how much did you see or had the chance to see and experience?
We saw a lot. We really traveled all parts of the country. Of course, there's much that we didn't see. There's so much to see. We traveled, first of all, Sofia is a beautiful city, uh, Eastern European in nature, but also very modern. We traveled to the other big cities of Bulgaria, Plovdiv, Varna, Burgas, and the villages, uh, Rila, Koprivstica. I can name a lot of villages, though many of them are hard to pronounce. The names are hard to pronounce. We visited caves, mountains, forests. The nature is really spectacular. And we had a chance to experience Bulgarian culture, whether it's the holidays, how they're experienced in the country, the villagers, the food, the cuisine, everything over the 2-year period while we were working with Bulgarians in the office. But whenever we had a chance on weekends to go out into the country, we did. And it was a wonderful experience.
Not just the food, I suppose, is what you experienced, also the drink.
Yes. Well, that comes to the name of the book, Rakia.
Yeah.
Rakia, for those who don't know, actually, it's the traditional drink of Bulgaria. It's a very strong liquor, similar to grappa in Italy, the raki in Turkey and Serbia. It's produced in Bulgaria commercially, but the best rakia in Bulgaria is homemade. Homemade by people in their basements, in their cellars, in their garages. And It's highly, it's very potent, high alcohol level. Um, it's made from different fruits, grapes, apricots, uh, plums, and it takes a while to get used to it. I mean, the first time I drank rakia, I almost passed out, but the more you drink, then you get used to it. I was got to a point where I was taking a shot of rakia every night. It helps
Oh,
cure the common cold. But the book is not about alcohol. Just
yeah.
because the first story of the book is about rakia, where two friends compete in a
Mm,
village competition to see who can produce the best
yeah.
homemade rakia. Certainly, the entire book is not about alcohol or not about the drink, but it's a catchy uh,
Yeah.
name for the collection. It's a powerful drink and one of the many things we experience while living in Bulgaria.
Mm. But also, you also write about the outcasts of society. There is this one short story about this woman and her daughter, and it ties back to another story in your book about the bakery, the Syrian baker, and how you describe them. I would say rather accurately
Mm,
those people who are outcasts. I mean, you get this type of outcasts in more than one Eastern European country. You also have Romani or Sinti people also here in Austria, and we all know they are still at the edge of society. I suppose it's the same could be said for Bulgaria as well.
yes, yes. Well, in my fiction, I tried to step away from just describing city goers or
Mm,
modern life in Bulgaria. Of course, the young people in Bulgaria, very educated, speak many languages. The
mm,
older generation maybe speak only Bulgarian and Russian.
yeah,
Younger, we managed it just fine in English. But in my fiction, I wanted to also relate to the people that you really don't hear their stories so much.
yeah,
Certainly, I didn't meet them in my office, so I had to imagine how their lives might be.
mm,
Um, you mentioned the Romani woman, the woman who's raising her daughter. Um, when I originally used the word gypsy to
mhm,
describe her, it was not politically correct. But in many ways, this is how people in Bulgaria relate to these people living among them as lower class people, certainly not even with the same rights, not even sure if all of them speak Bulgarian or
yeah,
recognize the state as their true home. But I wanted to give some humanity to these people. So I related to the mother trying to raise her daughter in extreme difficulties where she didn't have enough money to put food on the table.
yeah,
So that's one story in the book, mother and daughter. The other story that is related to that, these were the years of I pictured the years of the Syrian civil war, where thousands of Syrians, I don't know the exact number, were fleeing the country, trying to make a better life for themselves.
yeah,
And they were actually making their way through Europe. I don't know how many actually came to Austria, but certainly some came through Bulgaria on their way to better lives. Some of them envisioned lives in Scandinavia, but some stayed in Sofia. Um, I imagined a bakery in Sofia run by two brothers from Syria. And this was based on fact because as I went around Sofia, there was a Syrian bakery, there was a Lebanese bakery. These are not totally fictitious, but the way I related to a character, a former pediatrician from Damascus, having to work in a bakery in Sofia, this was entirely my imagination. And then the story connects to the previous story, mother and daughter, because the daughter falls ill and the pediatrician, now baker, must help care for that young girl. So they interconnect the two stories. But in both cases, there are people on the fringes of
Mm,
society, and that's what I wanted to
mm,
portray in fiction, some of their
mm,
stories.
mm. It was interesting how you incorporated those stories or tied them together
Mm.
when I read it. And you also have the short story um that where the nature features more or less. The bear story, which I found most interesting. You have these brothers. One of them is a police officer, and the other is a nature photographer, and they go on a hunt. And you leave it a bit open. Readers read for themselves what I mean by he left it open. There is not definitive ending to the short story. It also reminded me of the bears we now have in Austria, in the southern part of Austria, since the fall of the Iron Curtain. And did you also do a little bit of going into the nature, going into the woods, and
Yeah.
or hiking or something like that, where people said, "Oh, yeah, but please be careful. You might meet a bear out there."
Well, first of all, we did experience the nature. I, in particular, love to hike. Uh, Years after leaving Bulgaria, I went back for a week of hiking in the Rila and the Pirin Mountains, mountain hiking. It was just amazing. The years that we were there, we knew there were bears in the country, but nobody warned us uh, that it was dangerous to go into the woods. We did visit uh, a reserve where bears that were formerly kept in circuses were being rehabilitated, uh, not to be re-released to nature because they were not capable of living on their own. But we did see bears in Bulgaria safely. But the story that I tell in the book relates to a very true story of a bear attacking and killing a villager. So this actually happened. I don't know how often it happens, but there are bears in the mountains, in the forest, and I wanted to relate to it, but I also wanted to tell in the story about the two brothers, how this hunt for this killer bear brought them back together because their lives had taken different directions.
And like I said before, it was interesting reading your short stories and because it gives you an idea of Bulgaria, about the people, about society, about life in Bulgaria, also about the past, because one of your stories features on the past, not just the present. It's also interesting to learn what happened during the Second World War in Bulgaria. To be honest, I didn't know that. I didn't know that much about the role they played or Bulgaria played during the Second World War, and how they managed, for example, like you say in the story, to save their Jewish community more or less.
Mm. Well, this was something that we learned upon arriving in Sofia that we didn't know before. We didn't know that Bulgaria was aligned with the Nazis, but its entire community of some 50,000 Jews survived the Holocaust. They were still in Bulgaria. They were forced to leave their homes because there were certain laws enacted in Bulgaria, similar to the laws uh, in Germany at the time and other countries. But the entire community of 50,000 Jews survived. Um, that said, some 11,000 Jews in territories controlled by Bulgaria during the war in Macedonia and Thrace were sent to the concentration camps. The question that we learned exists and is even not answered fully today is who should be credited with saving the Jews. How did they survive? Maybe were they rescued or did they just survive? Um, there's many opinions whether it was Tsar Boris, whether it was the church, the Bulgarian church, whether it was brave politicians, or whether it was Bulgarian society, people who would not let their neighbors lose not only their property, but their life. So this was a period of Bulgarian history I knew nothing about before moving to Sofia. It amazed us. When I got back to Israel and I started writing fiction about our experience in Bulgaria, I said, I have to relate to this period in Bulgaria's history. But I'm not a writer of historical fiction. How do I do that? Do I do it as a novel? I realized I could never tell the story 100% accurately. I did a lot of research, but because even today there are arguments in Bulgaria about that period of time, I realized no matter what I said, someone would take issue with it. Still, I wanted to relate to it. And the best way I could do that was telling a story set in modern day of an Israeli who gets an invitation to go to a small village in Bulgaria where a war veteran, someone who served in the Bulgarian army during that period in World War II, wants to tell him something. What was it? And we learn in the story about that Bulgarian war veteran's past during the war. So I was able to relate to that period of history through the eyes and ears of someone in modern day, an Israeli learning about it for the first time, just as I learned about that period in history for the first time. And maybe readers will learn, as you said, who aren't familiar with this history as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the way you tell this story makes it for the reader also more relatable than any other way you could have chosen. I found it very compelling the way you told the story about the past, connecting it with the present, and so it was quite intriguing. And you touched upon your other books. You said you started out with writing suspense novels, thriller. I even would call it a thriller, one of them. And you also said it's different. And can you elaborate a little bit more? What is for you the great pleasure of writing a novel compared to writing short stories? Which is
Well,
which also is pleasurable for you. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it.
Right. So the first book I wrote was called Valley of Thracians. Now, another thing we learned when we lived in Bulgaria, that it has a very rich and long history of that was well before the period of the Romans. The Thracians were a militant tribe in the Balkans, and their remnants of that society can be seen in burial mounds and the silver and gold artifacts that can be seen all over the country. I envisioned the story of an American Peace Corps volunteer in Bulgaria who goes missing, and his grandfather comes from the United States to go searching for him. So this story that I envisioned in my mind could only be told in the format of a novel because there was so much to tell. Again, I don't write historical fiction, but I wanted to portray this long ago period of Bulgarian history. So I did it in the form of a novel where the professor looking for his grandson was able to travel around the country and experience this part of Bulgarian's history. So that I could do in the format of a novel. The short stories are easier and faster to write. They still encompass an entire story, but writing a novel took a lot out of me. It was a long process. Yes, there was some amount of research no matter what you write, but writing and then editing and then trying to market a novel, it takes not only months, it could take years. A short story I can write and finish very quickly, and marketing is still a challenge, finding a place to publish it. But the 12 stories of Rakia, I was able to write much faster, totally enjoyable process. And each of them found an online literary magazine which published them. And then I was able to collect them in this book, Rakia. Today, I continue to write short stories. It's just say what I came out of the experience of writing novels and short stories.
Okay.
I prefer to write short stories.
Okay. And question is also, of course, since you mentioned research, do you enjoy research or is it something you do not enjoy that much, unlike other
This,
authors?
the story you mentioned, Forgiveness, which is the story about Bulgaria's history during World
Mhm.
War II, that required a lot of
Mhm.
research. I've never done this extensive research. I sat in Yad Vashem, which is
Mhm.
Israel's memorial
Yeah.
to the Holocaust. I interviewed Bulgarian historians and journalists. I talked to ordinary Bulgarians to see what they knew about that period. I read testimonies of Jews who lived through those years and who later came to Israel to live after the war. So that was a huge project of research. And I was able to take a little bit of everything I learned and put it into the book. And still, some of the feedback I received from Bulgarian readers of the story, well, you misrepresented this, or the train track you describe in the book went to the left when you said it went to the right. Small things like that, but overall, my research, I would say, was complete. And even Bulgarians who read that story would say I depicted that period of history correctly
Mhm.
in a work of fiction. It's not nonfiction, a work of fiction. So I would say that the research, which was an enjoyable process and long, led to a lot of editing. What I could take out of that research, I'm not sure I'm capable of doing that much research for a short story. But
Okay.
again, I did it for this short story, but to do it again, I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. And your books are only published in English.
Yes.
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
actually, no.
No. Oh.
Actually, no. I'll correct myself. I didn't mention my second suspense novel, The Burgas Affair.
Yeah.
The Burgas Affair um, deals with something very real. When we lived in Bulgaria, we felt very safe, even identifying ourselves as Jews, as Israelis. Um, when we came back to Israel in 2011. 1 year later, in 2012, there was a tragic terrorist attack at Burgas Airport, where a busload of Israeli tourists were murdered. A number of tourists were murdered by a suicide bomber. And my novel envisions what happens next, where a Bulgarian policeman teams up with an Israeli woman from the Mossad, from Israel's Secret Service, to find out who was responsible for this very real terrorist attack. This book was actually published in Bulgaria, in Bulgarian, by the leading publisher in the country a year before I published it in English. So one of my books has been published in Bulgarian, and it came out first in that country before I published it in English. So that is the true story.
Oh, okay, I see. And are there any plans of doing the same for your other books?
For the other books, I don't know if there's a market in Bulgaria for an outsider's outlook on the country. Some of the stories in Rakia relate to Israelis visiting Bulgaria, experience Bulgarian culture. I don't know if that would interest someone living in Bulgaria, but you never know. You never know. You
Yeah,
never know.
exactly. You never know, indeed.
Yeah.
Would be interesting. And did you get feedback on the book that was published in Bulgarian from people in Bulgaria?
Yeah. Yes. Some people, friends who read it in Bulgarian,
Uh,
said, the voice of the book is not your voice. I don't know what the translator did, but he
uh,
obviously made it suitable for a Bulgarian
uh,
audience, a
uh,
readership in Bulgaria, which is fine. I have a copy of the book. I cannot read it. We learned some very basic words and sentences in Bulgarian, but certainly
mm.
not enough to read a book. But overall, I got good feedback from those who read it in Bulgarian.
Mhm.
And both my novels, I got a lot of good feedback from Bulgarians who said, thank you for bringing Bulgaria to the attention of readers all over the world. As I first mentioned to you, how many people have actually read books or stories set in Bulgaria?
Not many,
Not
because I
many.
haven't. I admit it. I haven't, to be honest. Uh, but you might have heard of, or not, I don't know, it's a very small publisher called Corylus Books. Have you heard of them?
No, I have
No.
not.
They made it, uh, the publishing house was founded just before the pandemic. I think it was 2020, just shortly before the whole COVID thing started. And the idea or the goal of this publisher is to publish novels which are not so commonly known in English. I mean, it's the goal to publish books in English or translate them into English from Eastern European countries. I'm not sure if they have a Bulgarian author, but they have Romanian authors.
Mm.
They have Spanish authors. And they have quite a few Icelandic authors.
Okay.
And we had at least 2 of the Romanian authors on the show.
Okay.
Also one of the Spanish authors and, of course, the Icelandic ones. So, because it is, like you said, it is not all the rest of Europe has rarely read books from Romanian authors. Because, you know, you need to translate them. If they write in Romanian, you need to translate them either into German or in English. And they do it for English. And the most recent translation was, one of the most recent translations was a book from a German author, crime fiction, from a German author into English.
Mm. Well, I go out of my way to read anything published by a Bulgarian author in English. There are very few books by Bulgarian authors that have been translated into English. I've read and reviewed quite a number of them. One author, Georgi Gospodinov, won the International Booker Prize for his recent book, Time Shelter. I've read books. I help bring them to the attention of international readers. I wish more Bulgarian authors would be translated. And I can do what I can do to help them.
Yeah, it's great. And I suppose Bulgarians read far more English than the rest of the world reads Bulgarian authors translated into German, yeah. Or English, for that matter. Yeah. Yeah. And you said you worked in internet marketing. May I ask, from, you know, authors usually wear more than one hat. They wear the author hat, and then they wear the public relations hat. And do you have any advice or tips for people out there who want to publish their books in regards of internet marketing? Because that's the thing, isn't it?
What I do in my day job, and I continue to work in a day job, has nothing to do with the world of publishing. I'm a manager of a content team, writing website content, press releases, has nothing to do with books or publishing. But you're right, there is the biggest challenge for writers these days is getting their books known. And of course, that is done primarily on the internet these days. Not all authors are fortunate enough to have a publishing house do the work for them. I have self-published 2 novels. My new book, Rakia, was published by a hybrid publisher in the United States. But in all cases, I had to do the marketing myself, whether it's through social media, trying to get the book mentioned in book newsletters, certainly reviewed on as many websites as possible to get reviews for Amazon, Goodreads. It's a challenge. It's part of an author's job. I would say it's the least satisfactory part because you don't always get responses, and it just takes a long time to find the correct places to look at, read, and possibly review your book. I much more enjoy writing, and I even more than writing, I enjoy editing, because I can write a first draft of story or a novel, but when you edit it, you make it come alive. You correct the language. You add better phrases, more relevant words. I've always enjoyed the editing process more than writing. But that's just me. A lot of people I know, a lot of writers prefer just writing. Who wants to deal with the editing? But I believe editing brings a book alive. But marketing a book is difficult. I would say it's almost maybe 50% of the work is trying to get your book known to readers. It's not easy.
Yeah, I would say so. I would agree. And having heard from other authors, yeah, you're right. And it's interesting. You are really one of the few who enjoys editing. And do you get lost in your editing process? Because you know what I mean. Some people always find something they want to change, and there is one point, or sometimes you have to say, "Okay, that's it, enough. I have to get it out there, otherwise it would never be published."
Well, that's the difference between writing a novel and writing a short story. A novel is so long that if you want to change something at the beginning, it might affect something at the end. It's just to edit a novel is quite difficult. A short story, when you have it told in a number of pages, you can make a change and quickly update everything. It's fine. As a self-published author, you have an advantage that you publish a book, you can come back to it a few years later and issue a new version. If you think that something wasn't right, you can change and edit and improve. Short stories, when you submit it to an online publication, sometimes there's an editor on their side who will make corrections and improve the story. And certainly some of the stories in Rakia, when I worked with the publisher, they provided an editor and his feedback was very good. And I was able to see things that I didn't see originally. And I think the final version of each and every story in the book is much better than what it was when I originally wrote the stories.
Oh, I see. And you said you self-published the other books, but I suppose you also had an editor which you paid for, or someone for the cover art.
Yes. With both novels, I worked with a freelance editor and a freelance graphic designer. In the case of Rakia, the publisher provided a graphic designer. If you show the cover, I'm very pleased with the result. I think it represents Bulgaria, the color green, because there's so much nature, the hint of a village, because the villages are so picturesque. When I think of Bulgaria, this is what I envisioned: the mountains, the forests, the rivers, and the villages. That's the part I really remember and am most fond of. It was lovely living in Sofia, but that's not what I think of when I envision Bulgaria.
Yeah, true. Yeah, most of us don't. I mean, I suppose most of us don't have an idea what it's like, but I think what we've heard from Bulgaria, it's a beautiful country, absolutely. There are parts that are absolutely wonderful, a lot of nature, just like Romania. You wouldn't believe it. I mean, and I'm not just talking about Transylvania, dear listeners. We're not just talking about, meaning Count Dracula, Which, yeah, well, one has to say it, doesn't one?
Living in Sofia, we had a chance to travel not only through Bulgaria, but the surrounding countries, including Romania, Serbia, Macedonia, Turkey. If anything comes out of readers reading my books, all three of the books set in Bulgaria, that they would one day consider visiting the country, which is something still off the beaten track for most people in Western Europe and in America. I think they would be totally surprised and see how wonderful it is to visit Bulgaria. Very reasonable as compared to in cost, as compared to other countries. Still, maybe this will change as Bulgaria adopts the euro. I don't know when it does,
Probably.
but if it opens the eyes to someone who said, I'd never considered going to Bulgaria. Bulgaria is much more than going for a ski vacation in the mountains in winter, much more than going to the resorts on the Black Sea, which are visited by many people from Eastern Europe or even from England. They come to the
Yeah.
resorts on the Black Sea coast. There's so much more than that. And at those places I tried not to relate to in my writing, but rather to other places that I hope will encourage tourism to the country.
There's also this connection you mentioned in your short stories with Greek mythology, which I found most intriguing, having been a fan of Xena the Warrior Princess for a very long time. I said, okay, geographically.
Yeah. There's another connection to Bulgarian history. There's so much in Bulgaria's history that you can learn. It has so many periods. One of them is the possible connection to Greek mythology. There's Orpheus was a poet, musician. He's considered Greek, but it's possible, and it can be argued that he was actually born in the village of Gela in southern Bulgaria. There are arguments. Sorry, book just fell. So I related to that period as well. We actually visited this village, Gela. It's a beautiful village in the Rhodope Mountains in southern Bulgaria, not far from the Greek border. And this is supposedly the birthplace of Orpheus. And there's a cave, Devil's Throat Cave, where he supposedly followed his loved one into the cave towards Hades in the underworld. And he was able to escape when his wife was not able to escape the underground. A Greek myth, but much of it can be argued took place in Bulgaria. So there is that connection as well. And I do relate to it in one of my short stories.
Yeah, that was quite fascinating to read. And okay, geographically, we are not in Greece anymore. We are in Bulgaria. And fascinating. Absolutely. So everyone finds something in your short stories, most definitely. There is a lot in there.
Yes. I was hoping to take different aspects of the country, of the culture, of the history, of the traditions, and present all of them from different angles. From the viewpoint of native-born Bulgarians and those visiting Bulgaria. So hopefully the many aspects were presented accurately, but also in such a way that encourages people to read and to visit the country.
I would say so. I would absolutely say so. It's a collage of Bulgarian life. Absolutely. And may I ask, now that you've written novels, suspense, and short stories, do you have any advice for other authors out there?
My advice would be to write. Personally, would want to read. I enjoy reading stories set in other countries. For me, Bulgaria, even the United States, for me, is a different country. I enjoy learning about different cultures and history and traditions. That's what enticed me to write about Bulgaria, where I had actually lived. But because I enjoy reading about these things, I wanted to write about these things. There's an advantage to write about something you know, because you have the background and experience and knowledge. But there's also a challenge to write about something you don't know, when you are required to research, but also to think outside the box and imagine something from another person's point of view. So the bottom line, I would say, the advice would be to write what you would want to read, because if no one else reads your writing, at least you should be. be satisfied with what you wrote. So
Now that you mentioned it, write what you know. Isn't that also something that is said in one of your short stories, where there is this conference, this author conference, and they talk about fiction writing and so on. And there's this, I mean, good argument. One says, okay, but how are you supposed then to write sci-fi if you are only supposed to
yes,
write what you know?
exactly.
You haven't. No one has ever been out there of those writers. So how are you supposed to write about a species which we know nothing about, or invent species, or I don't know, travel through space?
Well, I would assume authors who write science fiction also like to read science fiction. I do not. And that's why I do not write science fiction. Maybe that's my next challenge, but I don't think it will happen. But as you said, there's one story in the book that concerns is centered around an international writers conference. This actually does take place in Bulgaria. An Israeli author is attending this conference, and there's many discussions about writing short stories, how authors relate to the different aspects of short stories in their fiction. As you said, one is a romance author. I would assume she likes to read romance novels, and you
Who
never
knows?
know. Yeah,
Yes, indeed.
yeah.
And rumor has it, I've mentioned it before, I know, dear listeners, but rumor has it that romance authors are not the cuddly type.
It could be. I
Crime
wouldn't know.
crime fiction authors, they are very nice people. They're
Okay.
absolutely, you wouldn't think so, but they are very nice and very supportive of each other. And rumor has it, romance authors are more like, you know,
Right.
but I'm not sure about that. Just what I heard, rumor mill, you know. You said you do not read a sci-fi, or maybe that's your challenge. Do you think that you might step your toe in a genre you are not so familiar with sometime in the future?
I do try to read outside the box, outside things I normally read. The occasional book dealing with a period of history. I try to read authors, as I mentioned, Bulgarian authors whose works are translated into English. I've read Israeli authors in their native Hebrew. Of course, speak and read Hebrew, but reading in English is much more enjoyable to me because I learned Hebrew in high school, so it was always something considered homework or an assignment. But I do step out of my normal reading patterns to read books in their native Hebrew. So I'm always looking for different kinds
Yeah.
things to read. I've read nonfiction. Uh, my wife and I took a trip to uh, Italy. I read a biography of Michelangelo. I read a biography of Leonardo da Vinci, just to give me background for that trip. So I'm always looking for new things to read, but not necessarily science fiction.
But what about writing? Would you say there's something you would absolutely love to try, but haven't dared so far?
Well, you mentioned at the very beginning my self entitled description as a travel writer. Um, After our trip to Italy, I did write 3 stories set in Italy um, about uh, people visiting Italy, about even one attempt at historical fiction about Marco Polo. So that was an example of how a trip led to me writing differently because most of my stories are either set in Israel, in Bulgaria, or some in the United States. I had never written fiction set in Italy before. So who knows? Maybe one day there'll be a collection of books set in Italy. I don't imagine that happening, but you never know.
Yep. Who knows? Maybe. So that brings me to another question. What can we as readers expect next from you?
Short stories. In fact, just a few hours before talking to you today, I finished writing my latest short story, a new short story,
Okay.
and it received approval from my editor, which is my wife, who reviews stories and finds possible not only typos, but errors in judgment, type thing. So that story has now been submitted to a publication. I have a number of stories currently on submission at different places. I have a few stories that should be published in the coming weeks, including in a Scottish international magazine, in a well, I don't want to give too much details because they're not yet public, but anyone visiting my blog can certainly get up-to-date notifications of where and when my stories are being published. So I am continuing to write, and as I mentioned today, I actually finished and submitted one story set in Israel to a publication. We'll see if it gets accepted.
Fingers crossed. And may I ask one last question? How harsh is your in-house editor?
My wife is the best editor there is. I mean, as a writer, you can write something and think you're getting your message across. You're sure you've done it. I'm not even talking about the language, but the message behind your stories. When Rakia came out, obviously my wife had read every single story in the book along the way before it was originally submitted and published. But only after the book was published in June 2024, she reread it in its entirety as a book. And as you noted, it was a collage of different aspects, and she saw it all come together, the vision I had of telling about Bulgaria. So not only was she an editor who helped me along the way, getting my stories to a level that I could present them to readers all over the world, but she helped me bring this vision to reality and get this book finished and published and to the hands of readers.
And dear readers, you should absolutely take it up. It's wonderful. If you want to learn more about Bulgaria, about culture of Bulgaria, the past and the present, take it up and read it.
I hope so.
Yeah, absolutely. Ellis, is there anything else you would like our listeners to know?
I will repeat what I previously said just to give it emphasis. I hope readers enjoy the stories as fiction, a little bit of learning about history. That is certainly something most readers would not know. Even those who know of the history of those years of World War II and the Holocaust, even Israelis who study this period do not know of that period of time in Bulgaria's rich history. But more than that, I not only enjoy the fiction, I hope they realize, as I mentioned before, that Bulgaria is a country worth visiting, worth considering visiting, because it is not commonly on the track of most tourists.
Yeah.
The advantage of that is that when you visit the country, you're not competing with the throngs of tourists who visit Amsterdam and Paris and Barcelona, those cities that I visited, places that I visited. There's so many tourists. Visiting Sofia, you'll see there's not too many tourists on the street. There are, but it's an undiscovered, unknown destination. I hope my book gets readers there, not only through fiction, but also consider traveling there.
Yeah, we hope so too. Not too many, of course.
Yes.
It's never good if there are too many of those. They can also be quite a pain. Ellis, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for having me. It was great talking to you and to the readers who are listening.
Great to have you on, and please don't go away. Wait for me in the green room. I will be with you shortly.
Okay.
Dear listeners, I do hope you enjoyed this episode as much as my guest and I did. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we do hope you will tune in for another episode as well. Until next time.